The quiet hum of a transatlantic flight's first-class cabin is a sanctuary of privilege, a world separated from the noise of ordinary life. But on Ascend Air Flight 112, from JFK to London, that sanctuary was about to be shattered. A confrontation was brewing, one fueled by whispered prejudice and unchecked arrogance. It began with a simple request from a wealthy passenger, Caroline Beaumont, to the black man sitting in her preferred seat. She expected him to move to acquiesce to the unspoken rules of her world. What she didn't know was that the man was Damien Vance, a corporate titan, and that the entire board of the airline was about to walk down the jet bridge. She wasn't just picking a fight with a passenger. She was about to author the spectacular end of her own empire at 35,000 feet. The first-class cabin of Ascend Air's flagship A350 was a meticulously crafted cocoon of muted luxury. The scent of new leather and subtle neroli lingered in the filtered air. The lighting was set to a gentle, pre-dusk amber, casting a warm glow on the brushed aluminum and polished wood trim of the private suites. Each pod was a sanctuary, complete with a lie-flat bed, a 24-inch screen, and a small, artfully arranged vase holding a single white orchid. For the 8 passengers who occupied this rarefied space, the $14,000 ticket was not just for a seat, but for a seamless, frictionless transition between continents, a bubble of tranquility suspended above the clouds. Damien Vance had settled into his seat 2A, a bulkhead suite with ample legroom that allowed his 6'3" frame to stretch out comfortably. He wasn't one for ostentation. His suit was a bespoke but understated charcoal grey from Savile Row, Taylor, Anderson and Shepherd, his watch a classic IWC Portuguesa with a simple leather strap. It was a timepiece that spoke of engineering and precision, not of diamonds and gold. On the polished burlwood counter beside him lay a worn, leather-bound copy of Seneca's Letters from a Stoic, and a thick financial prospectus, its cover simply marked Project Nightingale. He was the founder and CEO of Airline Dynamics, a company that had revolutionized logistical AI, and in less than a decade had grown into a behemoth valued at over $50 billion. But to a casual observer, he was simply a tall, well-dressed black man reading a book. He had chosen this flight specifically for its timing, allowing him a few hours of focused work before a brief sleep landing him in London, ready for a series of critical morning meetings. The most important of which was with the board of Ascend Air itself, a company Airline was considering a major strategic partnership with. He was flying incognito, as he often did, booked under a personal name without corporate titles, preferring to observe the service organically. The quietude was broken by a flurry of motion and a voice that sliced through the calm. "Richard, for heaven's sake, watch the Birkin." That flight attendant nearly scuffed it. Caroline Beaumont arrived in a cloud of Chanel No. 5 and audible discontent. She was a woman sculpted by wealth and entitlement, her blonde hair coiffed into a severe but expensive bob, her face a mask of smooth, taut skin that defied her 50-some years. Her husband, Richard Beaumont, trailed in her wake, a man whose presence seemed to have been perpetually muted by his wife's volume. He was the head of Beaumont Holdings, a commercial real estate empire built on his father's grit, and now managed with his own brand of cautious, risk-averse complacency. Caroline's sharp blue eyes scanned the cabin, dismissing the other passengers with a cursory glance. Her gaze landed on Damien in seat 2A, and stopped. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. She turned to her husband, her voice a stage whisper that carried through the entire cabin. "Well, that's just typical," she huffed, gesturing vaguely with a hand laden with a diamond the size of a robin's egg. "I specifically told your assistant to book us the bulkhead seats, 2A and 2B. The extra space is essential for my legs." Richard, flustered, pulled out his phone. "I'm sure she did, dear. Let me just check the boarding passes." He fumbled with the screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. Caroline ignored him. She strode down the aisle until she was standing over Damien's suite, her shadow falling across the pages of his book. He had been aware of her from the moment she boarded her energy, sucking the oxygen from the cabin. He had encountered women like her his entire life, women who saw the world as a hierarchy with them firmly at the apex, and who saw his skin color as an immediate and disqualifying mark of a lower station. He didn't look up immediately, choosing instead to finish his paragraph, a small act of defiance, a refusal to be summoned. Finally, he placed his leather bookmark carefully between the pages and raised his head. He looked at her with a calm, neutral expression, his dark eyes betraying nothing. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low, steady baritone. The directness and composure seemed to throw her for a second. She had expected deference, perhaps a flustered apology. "Yes," she said, recovering her imperious tone. "I believe you're in my seat." She didn't phrase it as a question. It was a statement of fact. "I don't believe so," Damien replied calmly. "My boarding pass says 2A." "And I'm sure it does," Caroline said, her smile a patronizing slash of red lipstick. "But there's clearly been a mistake. An upgrade, perhaps. Sometimes they get a little overzealous with the loyalty programs for athletes or entertainers. My husband and I are in 2A and 2B. We always are." The insinuation was as thick and cloying as her perfume. He couldn't possibly belong here on his own merit. He had to be a beneficiary of some sort of handout. From the galley, a flight attendant named Chloe, a young woman with a kind but nervous smile, noticed the confrontation brewing. She hurried over, her Ascend Air uniform immaculate. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" "Yes, there's a problem," Caroline snapped, turning on Chloe. "This man is in my seat. I need you to fix this, now." Richard finally caught up, holding his phone. Darling," he said weakly. "It seems we're in 3A and 3B. Just behind." Caroline's eyes flashed with fury, first at her husband, then back at the airline employee. "That is unacceptable. I booked the bulkhead. My husband's firm spends millions of dollars with this airline. We are concierge key members. This is not the seat I booked." Chloe maintained her professional smile, though it was beginning to strain at the edges. "I understand your frustration, Mrs. Beaumont. Let me see your boarding pass, sir," she said to Damien, her voice soft and respectful. Damien handed it to her. Chloe scanned it with her device. "Yes, sir. You are correctly seated in 2A. Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont, your suites are 3A and 3B. The bulkhead seats were already assigned when your tickets were purchased." This was for Caroline Beaumont an impossibility. The world as she knew it bent to her will. Her money, her status, her husband's influence, they were levers she pulled to ensure a life free of such inconveniences. The idea that this man, this black man, had secured something she could not, was an affront to the very foundations of her reality. "I don't care what your little machine says," she spat, her voice rising. "He needs to move. We can compensate him for his trouble." She waved a dismissive hand, as if offering a pittance to a valet who had parked her Bentley. Damien watched the exchange, his face an unreadable mask. He hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. Caroline Beaumont was doing all the work for him, laying bare the ugly architecture of her prejudice for the entire cabin to see. The silence from seat 2A was becoming heavier, more profound than any argument he could have made. It was the calm before a storm she had no idea she was summoning. The air in the first-class cabin grew thick with tension. The other passengers who had initially tried to mind their own business behind the privacy of their suite walls were now surreptitiously watching the drama unfold. A hedge fund manager in 1A lowered his copy of the Wall Street Journal. A tech heiress in 4F paused her movie. They were all witnesses now. Damien Vance finally spoke again, his voice still low and even a stark contrast to Caroline's shrill demands. "I'm quite comfortable where I am," he said, looking directly at Caroline. "And I'm not interested in moving. I suggest you take your assigned seat." His refusal was a match struck in a gas-filled room. Caroline's face, already tight with indignation, contorted into a mask of pure fury. The thin veneer of condescending politeness evaporated, replaced by raw, unvarnished entitlement. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "Do you have any idea who I am? Who my husband is?" "I have no idea," Damien replied, his tone suggesting he also had no interest in finding out. He picked up his book, a clear signal that for him, the conversation was over. This act of dismissal was more than Caroline could bear. "No, you don't get to dismiss me," she shrieked, her voice echoing in the confined space. "You people come in here with your new money and think you can just do whatever you want. This cabin has standards. Some of us have been flying this route for 20 years. The phrase, 'you people,' hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. It was the final confirmation of what everyone already knew. This wasn't about a seat. This was about race and class, a toxic cocktail that Caroline Beaumont was now sloshing all over the pristine cabin. Richard Beaumont, who looked as if he would rather be anywhere else on earth, stepped forward and placed a placating hand on his wife's arm. "Caroline, please," he muttered, his face beet red. "Let's just sit down. We can sort it out with the airline later. We'll get 1,000,000 miles a bottle of champagne." She shook him off with a vicious shrug. "I don't want miles, Richard. I want respect. I want this person out of my seat." She turned her fury back to Chloe, the flight attendant who was now pale and visibly shaken. "Are you going to do your job or not? Or do I need to speak to your supervisor?" "The captain. The CEO of this entire airline. I assure you, Richard has his number on speed dial." Chloe swallowed hard, her training kicking in. "Ma'am, the passenger in 2A is correctly ticketed. I cannot ask him to move. It is against our policy to displace a passenger who is in their assigned seat." She looked at Damien apologetically. "Sir, I do apologize for this disturbance." "It's not your fault, Chloe," Damien said, using her name, which he'd noted from her name tag. The small act of personal recognition seemed to steady her. Caroline saw this brief alliance as a betrayal. "Oh, so now you're on his side. Unbelievable. You'll be hearing from our lawyers. Your job, your pension gone." The threats were empty, but delivered with the absolute conviction of someone who had never faced a consequence. The head purser, a stern-looking man named Graham, had been alerted and now arrived from the business-class cabin. He was a veteran of the airline, with a face that had seen every kind of in-flight incident. "What seems to be the trouble here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Chloe quickly and professionally summarized the situation. "Mrs. Beaumont is refusing to take her assigned seat in 3A and is demanding that the passenger in 2A be moved." Graham turned to Caroline. "Mrs. Beaumont, he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "We have a full flight, and I cannot reseat you. The gentleman in 2A is in the seat designated by his ticket. I must now ask you to take your seat immediately. We are already behind schedule for pushback." "I will not," Caroline declared, crossing her arms. "This is a matter of principle. I will stand in this aisle until you remove him from the flight." Graham's eyes hardened. "Ma'am, if you continue to refuse to comply with a crew member's instructions, you will be in violation of federal aviation regulations. If you refuse to take your seat, you will be deplaned. The choice is yours." It was a final, clear line in the sand. Richard understood it. He grabbed his wife's arm again, this time with more force. "Caroline, that's enough. You're going to get us arrested. We have the Kensington Gala tonight. Think of the press." The mention of social suicide seemed to finally penetrate her rage. For a moment it seemed she might back down. She shot a look at Damien that was pure venom, a look that promised retribution. She then turned her glare on Graham. "Fine," she snarled, as if she were the one making a grand concession. "I will sit in that other seat. But this is not over. I will be filing a formal complaint against your entire crew. And as for him," she said, nodding her head towards Damien, "I'll be making sure Ascend Air reviews its upgrade policies to ensure people who actually belong here get the seats they deserve." With a final dramatic huff, she allowed Richard to guide her one row back to Suite 3A. She slammed her designer handbag onto the counter and slumped into the leather seat, refusing to buckle her seatbelt in a last petty act of defiance, until Chloe had to stand over her and insist. The cabin fell into an uneasy silence. The immediate crisis was over, but the atmosphere was poisoned. Graham gave Damien a brief apologetic nod before retreating. Chloe, looking flustered, continued her pre-flight checks, her hands trembling slightly. Damien Vance, however, appeared utterly unfazed. He reopened his book, his expression serene. But inside his mind was racing. He was not angry. Anger was a corrosive emotion, a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he was processing data. He had observed Caroline Beaumont's behavior, her husband's weakness, the crew's professionalism under pressure. He had gathered all the information he needed. He thought of Project Nightingale, the Etherian Ascend Air partnership. He thought of the upcoming meeting with the board, and he thought of the Beaumonts. He had a vague recollection of their name from a preliminary real estate proposal that had crossed his desk weeks ago. A hugely ambitious project, the Beaumont Tower, a new European headquarters for a major tech company. A deal worth hundreds of millions, a deal they were desperately trying to land with Etherian dynamics. A small, cold smile touched Damien's lips, unseen by anyone. Caroline Beaumont had no idea what she had just done. The unraveling was only just beginning. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at JFK and rumbled towards the runway. Inside the first-class cabin, a fragile peace had settled, though the emotional residue of Caroline's outburst still clung to the air. The other passengers spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing towards row 3, where Caroline sat fuming, a glass of champagne held in a white-knuckled grip. She had demanded the best champagne, a vintage Dom Perignon they usually reserved for their most elite flyers, and consumed the first glass in 2 angry gulps. Richard, meanwhile, was sweating. He was frantically typing on his phone, no doubt communicating with his office, trying to gauge the potential fallout. He knew his wife had crossed a line, but his entire life was a testament to his inability to rein her in. He would placate, apologize, and throw money at problems until they went away. But he had a sinking feeling that this problem was different. Damien, in seat 2A, had put away his book and was now reviewing the Project Nightingale prospectus on his tablet. The screen cast a cool blue light on his face. He was the picture of concentration, his focus absolute. To Caroline, this was another insult. The man's unflappable composure was an indictment of her own lack of control. She couldn't stand it. As the plane leveled off at its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, Chloe began the meal service. She approached Damien's suite first, her smile warmer, now a gesture of gratitude for his quiet dignity during the earlier confrontation. "Mr. Vance," she said softly, "can I get you a drink before dinner? And may I say on behalf of the crew, I am truly sorry for the unpleasantness during boarding." "It's quite all right, Chloe. You handled it perfectly," Damien replied, his tone reassuring. "I'll have a sparkling water with lime, please." The simple, polite exchange was for Caroline the final straw. It was the civility of it all, the camaraderie between the flight attendant and the man she had tried to eject, that sent her over the edge. She unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up, and lurched into the aisle, her movements unsteady from the champagne and her rage. "Unbelievable," she announced to the cabin at large. "You're apologizing to him. He's the one who caused all this trouble." Chloe froze, a look of dismay on her face. Graham, the purser, was instantly on his feet and moving towards them from the galley. "Mrs. Beaumont, you need to sit down," Graham commanded, his voice sharp and low. "You are interfering with a crew member in the performance of her duties." But Caroline was beyond listening to reason. She pointed a trembling finger at Damien. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Sitting there so quietly, acting all high and mighty. Where did you get the money for a ticket like this? Did you win the lottery? Are you a rapper? Did you get some kind of diversity grant?" The questions were a rapid-fire assault of stereotypes, each one more offensive than the last. The cabin fell into a shocked, profound silence. This was no longer a squabble over a seat. This was a naked, ugly display of prejudice. Damien slowly powered down his tablet and placed it on the counter. He turned in his seat to face her fully, his expression no longer neutral. It was now one of cold, hard clarity. It was the look he gave a rival CEO just before a hostile takeover. "That's enough," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that cut through her drunken tirade. "Don't you tell me when it's enough," she shrieked. "I am a customer, a valuable customer, and you are just a diversity hire sitting in a seat you didn't earn." It was the point of no return. She had said the unsayable, articulated the vile prejudice that had been simmering beneath her entitled exterior. In the back of the cabin, the tech heiress in 4F had discreetly propped her phone up against her window. The red recording light was on. Richard was now on his feet, pleading. "Caroline, for God's sake, stop. You're destroying us." He grabbed her, trying to physically pull her back into her seat. She fought him off. "Let go of me, Richard. For once in your life, stand up for your wife, for our position. Why are you letting this man humiliate me?" "You are humiliating yourself." Damien stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was a simple, brutal truth, and it seemed to land with more force than any of her shrieks. At that moment, Graham the purser made a decision. He touched his earpiece. "This is the purser. I have a code red situation in the first-class cabin. An abusive, non-compliant passenger. I need the captain to be informed immediately. We are officially issuing her a final warning." He then addressed Caroline directly, his face grim. "Mrs. Beaumont, this is your final and official warning from the captain of this aircraft. You will return to your seat, buckle your seatbelt, and you will not speak to or interfere with any other passenger or crew member for the remainder of this flight. If you violate this order in any way, you will be restrained, and the aircraft will be met by law enforcement upon our arrival in London. Do you understand? The mention of law enforcement, of being physically restrained, finally seemed to register. The image of being hauled off a plane by police, the inevitable headlines in the tabloids, the sheer unimaginable social disgrace, it was a horror even her arrogance couldn't dismiss. Her face went pale. The fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a sullen, simmering resentment. She stared at Damien one last time, her eyes filled with a potent mixture of hatred and, for the first time, a flicker of fear. She had pushed too far, and she knew it. Without another word, she stumbled back to her suite and collapsed into the seat. Richard, looking utterly defeated, buckled her in as if she were a child. He sank into his own seat, burying his face in his hands. The cabin was deathly quiet. Chloe, looking deeply shaken, retreated to the galley. Graham stood in the aisle for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the Beaumonts, before giving Damien a single grim nod and returning to his duties. The flight would continue to London. But something had been irrevocably broken. Caroline Beaumont, in her blind rage, had not just caused a scene. She had laid a charge of dynamite at the foundation of her own life. And as Damien Vance calmly requested his sparkling water again, he knew that the fuse had been lit. The detonation was coming, and it was going to be spectacular. The remaining 5 hours of the flight passed in a strained, artificial calm. The Beaumonts remained in their suite, speaking only in hushed, agitated whispers. The meal service was conducted with a somber efficiency. Damien ate his pan-seared halibut, worked on his prospectus, and then reclined his seat for a few hours of sleep, as calm and composed as if the preceding events had never occurred. His ability to compartmentalize, to remain focused on his objective, was one of the core reasons for his success. He would deal with the Beaumonts, but on his own terms, and at the optimal moment. As the A350 began its smooth descent into London Heathrow, the cabin came back to life. The early morning light of the British Isles filtered through the windows. The crew prepared for landing, their movements crisp and professional. Damien was one of the first to have his things packed away, ready to deplane. He was looking forward to a shower at the arrivals lounge before his meeting. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and as it taxied towards the terminal, the purser Graham approached Damien's seat. "Mr. Vance," he said in a low voice, "I've already submitted my full report to corporate security and the captain. It details Mrs. Beaumont's behavior in full. I've also noted your remarkable restraint. We will be taking this matter very seriously." "Thank you, Graham. I appreciate that," Damien said. "You and your crew handled a difficult situation with immense professionalism." The plane docked at the gate, and the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign turning off chimed through the cabin. Usually there was a polite jostling as first-class passengers gathered their belongings, eager to be the first off. Today, however, there was a strange stillness. Everyone seemed to be waiting. The Beaumonts remained seated, Caroline staring out the window, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The jet bridge connected with a dull thud. The cabin door hissed open. But instead of the usual flow of disembarking passengers, a group of people walked onto the plane. There were 4 of them, all dressed in immaculate business attire. They exuded an aura of authority and purpose that immediately commanded the attention of the entire cabin. Leading them was an older gentleman with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes, a man whose face was familiar from the pages of Forbes and The Economist. He was Sir Reginald Abernathy, the chairman of the board of Ascend Air. Flanking him were two other board members, a sharp, intelligent-looking woman of Asian descent. Eleanor Chen, known for her ruthless efficiency, and a burly, red-faced Irishman named Patrick Sullivan, who ran the airline's powerful pilots' union. Bringing up the rear was the airline's CEO, David Macmillan. They were not supposed to be there. A meeting of this importance would happen in a sterile Heathrow boardroom, not on the jet bridge of a freshly arrived flight. Their presence was a significant and unusual event. Caroline Beaumont's head snapped around. Her eyes widened. She recognized Sir Reginald immediately. He was a titan of industry, a man whose social circle she desperately wanted to penetrate. A flicker of something hope, opportunity, flashed across her face. Perhaps she could appeal to him directly, a person of her own class, and explain the dreadful service she had received. Richard Beaumont, however, looked like he'd seen a ghost. His business instincts screamed that this was terribly, terribly wrong. The board of directors did not personally greet a flight unless a major incident had occurred or a passenger of immense importance was on board. The delegation walked down the aisle, their serious expressions causing the other passengers to shrink back in their seats. They passed row 3, ignoring the Beaumonts completely. They passed the tech heiress and the hedge fund manager. They walked directly to seat 2A. Sir Reginald Abernathy broke into a warm, genuine smile. He extended his hand towards Damien, who was now standing. "Damien, so glad you could make it." Sir Reginald boomed his voice, full of jovial respect. "I hope the flight was smooth. David and the team are eager to walk you through the final details of Project Nightingale. We had the latest projections sent to your tablet mid-flight." Damien shook his hand firmly. "Reginald, it's good to see you. The flight was illuminating." He cast a quick, unreadable glance back towards row 3. Eleanor Chen stepped forward. "Damien, a pleasure. We're all incredibly excited. Your AI's potential to revolutionize our global logistics is all anyone in the office can talk about." Patrick Sullivan clapped him on the shoulder. "The man of the hour. Let's get you to the lounge. We've got a proper English breakfast waiting for you." The entire cabin was frozen in a state of collective shock. The blood drained from Caroline Beaumont's face. Her perfectly made-up features seemed to crumble the mask of superiority, disintegrating to reveal a slack-jawed, horrified gape. The man she had berated, insulted, and tried to have thrown off the flight was not a rapper, not an athlete, not a diversity hire. He was Damien Vance, the Damien Vance of Ethereum Dynamics, the billionaire tech genius who was on the cover of Wired last month, the man whose company was considering a multi-billion-dollar deal with this very airline, a deal that would secure Ascend Air's dominance for the next decade. And the board of directors had just walked onto the plane to personally escort him to their meeting. Richard Beaumont looked as if he was having a heart attack. His hand went to his chest, and he made a small gasping sound. He stared at his wife, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond social embarrassment. It was the terror of utter and complete financial ruin. He finally understood what he had been trying to tell her, what she had refused to hear. "Caroline," he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping sound. "What have you done?" But Caroline couldn't answer. She was staring at Damien Vance, who was now chatting easily with the most powerful people in the airline industry. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't lost his temper. He had simply waited. He had waited for the world to realign itself around the truth of who he was. And in that realignment, Caroline Beaumont was being crushed. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with horrifying speed in Caroline Beaumont's mind. The quiet confidence of the man in 2A, his expensive but understated suit, his complete lack of reaction to her threats. It wasn't weakness, it was power. A kind of power so immense, so absolute, that it didn't need to announce itself. Her world, which was built on the fragile scaffolding of inherited wealth and social status, had just collided with the solid bedrock of genuine self-made influence. Damien, seeing the look of dawning horror on the Beaumonts' faces, paused his conversation with Sir Reginald. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon them. There was no malice in his eyes, no triumph. There was something far more chilling assessment. He was looking at them as one would look at a failed component in a complex machine, a variable that had proven to be fatally flawed. Sir Reginald Abernathy followed his gaze. He had been briefed by the captain via satellite phone about a disruptive passenger incident in first class involving a VIP, but the raw, unfiltered details were now becoming apparent in the tableau of shock and terror before him. He saw the pale, trembling face of Caroline Beaumont and the ashen, panicked expression of her husband. "Is there a problem, Damien?" Sir Reginald asked, his voice losing its jovial edge and taking on a tone of cold steel. "Not anymore, Reginald," Damien replied smoothly. "Just a minor in-flight service issue that I'm sure your team has already logged." Graham, the purser who had been standing by, silently stepped forward. "Sir Reginald," he said, his voice firm and clear, "I have a full report. Mrs. Beaumont in 3A engaged in abusive and discriminatory language towards Mr. Vance, repeatedly refusing to follow crew instructions and causing a significant disturbance that required a final warning from the captain." Eleanor Chen's eyes narrowed to slits. Patrick Sullivan crossed his brawny arms, his expression thunderous. As the head of the pilots' union, he had zero tolerance for passengers who harassed crew and endangered the order of a flight. It was at that moment that Richard Beaumont's survival instincts, dormant for so long under his wife's domineering presence, finally kicked in. He scrambled out of his seat and practically fell into the aisle, his hands raised in a gesture of supplication. "Sir Reginald, Mr. Vance, please," he stammered, his voice cracking. "A terrible, terrible misunderstanding. My wife, she's been under a great deal of stress. The flight, the pressure. She didn't mean anything by it." He was sweating profusely now, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting. Caroline watched her husband's groveling with a sense of detached horror. He was throwing her to the wolves to save himself, to save their empire. But it was too late. The damage was done. Damien Vance then did something that sealed their fate more surely than any outburst could have. He addressed Richard directly, his voice calm and surgical. "Mr. Beaumont," he began, and the use of his name made Richard flinch. "I recall your name. Beaumont Holdings. You submitted a proposal for Etherion's new European headquarters, the Beaumont Tower, I believe it was called." Hope, desperate and pathetic, flickered in Richard's eyes. Yes, that's us. A state-of-the-art facility perfect for a company of your stature. We'd be honored to—" Damien cut him off, not by raising his voice, but by simply continuing his sentence. "The proposal was ambitious, but at Etherion, we build our foundations on more than just steel and glass. We build them on partnerships, on mutual respect, on a shared vision for the future. Our corporate culture is our most valuable asset." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He then turned his gaze to Sir Reginald. "Reginald," he said, his voice now carrying the weight of a final judgment. "Regarding that proposal, I believe we can officially inform Beaumont Holdings that Etherian Dynamics will be moving in a different direction. It's clear our core values are not aligned." The words were delivered without emotion, a simple statement of business fact. But for Richard Beaumont, they were a death sentence. The Beaumont Tower project was his Hail Mary, a legacy-defining deal worth nearly $1 billion that would have secured his company for the next 50 years, without it burdened by the debt he had taken on to acquire the land and permits. Beaumont Holdings was financially exposed, vulnerable, and likely facing ruin. Richard's face went from ashen to a ghastly shade of grey. He looked at his wife, the architect of their destruction, with eyes that were suddenly empty of anything but despair. All the years of placating her, of enabling her casual cruelties and unchecked ego had led to this single cataclysmic moment. Caroline finally found her voice, but it was a pathetic, choked whisper. "No. Please. I apologize. I am so sorry. I didn't know who you were." And that was her final, fatal mistake. Damien's expression hardened for the first time. "That is the entire problem, Mrs. Beaumont," he said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper that cut her to the core. "You are not sorry for what you did. You are sorry for who you did it to. My identity should not determine my right to be treated with basic human dignity. Your apology is worthless." With that, he turned his back on them, a final, complete dismissal. "Reginald," he said, his voice returning to its normal, composed tone. "Shall we?" Sir Reginald Abernathy nodded grimly. He gave a curt signal to Graham. "Purser, please ensure Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont remain on the aircraft. Airport security will be here momentarily to escort them to a private room to discuss their violations of the Air Carrier Access Act and crew interference regulations. Their connecting flights are cancelled, and their status with this airline is now under permanent review." The reckoning was swift, professional, and absolute. There was no screaming, no further argument, just the cold, quiet machinery of consequence grinding into motion. As Damien Vance and the Ascend Air Board walked off the plane into the London morning, they left behind the smouldering ruins of the Beaumont Empire, a testament to the fact that karma, much like a transatlantic flight, sometimes has a very long runway. But the landing is always final. The escort off the plane was the beginning of the Beaumont's public humiliation. It wasn't done with sirens and flashing lights, but with a quiet, devastating efficiency that was far worse. 2 stern-faced Heathrow security officers and an Ascend Air corporate legal representative met them at the cabin door. They were not offered the VIP electric cart. They were walked through the bustling terminal past the curious and judging eyes of other travelers. Whispers followed them. The tech heiress from 4F, whose phone had been recording, was already uploading the most damning clips to her private Instagram story, which was then screen-recorded and shared by her thousands of followers. The spark had been lit, and the digital wildfire was beginning to spread. They were led to a sterile, windowless room deep within the terminal. The legal representative, a woman with an impeccably tailored suit and an expression that could curdle milk, laid out the situation in stark, unemotional terms. They were being banned from Ascend Air. For life. Their accumulated millions of frequent flyer miles were forfeited. A formal complaint was being filed with the UK Civil Aviation Authority. They would be billed for the costs associated with the flight delay they caused. And the lawyer concluded, sliding a tablet across the table. "This is the current top trending topic on Twitter." On the screen was the hashtag Airline. Karen accompanied by the grainy but clear video of Caroline's racist tirade. Her shrieking, contorted face was now global. The clip of her demanding to know if Damien was a rapper or a grant recipient was playing on a loop juxtaposed with photos of him on the cover of Forbes. The internet was a ruthless jury, and the verdict was unanimous. Caroline stared at the screen, a low, guttural moan escaping her lips. This was a social death from which there was no recovery. The Kensington Gala they were supposed to attend that night. They would be pariahs. Every charity board she sat on, every exclusive club they belonged to. The calls for her resignation would begin before lunch. Richard, however, was focused on the more immediate financial apocalypse. While the legal representative droned on his phone, was vibrating incessantly, it was his CFO, his brokers, his bankers. He finally answered, his hand trembling. "What is it, Charles?" he croaked. The voice on the other end was frantic. "Richard, what the hell is going on?" "The Ethereum deal is dead." Their general counsel called me personally. They withdrew the offer, citing irreconcilable differences in corporate values. The news is already leaking to the financial press. Our stock is in free fall. It's down 40% in pre-market trading. Richard's world tilted on its axis. 40%. That was hundreds of millions of dollars of value erased in a matter of minutes, all because of a fight over a seat. The debt he'd taken on for the Tower project was now a crushing weight and anchor that would drag his entire company to the bottom of the sea. "The banks are calling, Richard," his CFO continued, his voice strained. "The loan covenants for the Tower development were tied to securing a primary tenant. Without Ethereum, we're in breach. They're threatening to call in the loans, all of them." It was over. Beaumont Holdings, the company his father had built from nothing, was going to be dismembered and sold for parts. Their personal fortune, inextricably tied to the company's stock, was evaporating. They were ruined. The cascade of karma was relentless. By the time they were finally released from the Heathrow interrogation room, their lives had been dismantled. Their phones were a ceaseless torrent of terrible news. The story was now the lead item on BBC News, CNN, and Bloomberg. Real estate tycoon's wife in racist rant costs company billion-dollar deal. Their photos were everywhere. Journalists were already camped outside their London townhouse and their estate in the Hamptons. A statement from Ethereum Dynamics had been released. It was a masterpiece of corporate communication written by Damien himself. It didn't mention the Beaumonts by name. It simply read, "Ethereum Dynamics is built on innovation integrity and a fundamental respect for all people. Our partners must reflect these values. We believe that true strength lies in diversity, and true progress is impossible without dignity. We remain committed to building a future where talent and character are the only metrics that matter." The statement was lauded, and Ethereum's stock, in contrast to Beaumont Holdings, ticked up 2%. The fallout in their personal life was just as brutal. Richard's brother, who ran a competing real estate firm, called not to offer sympathy, but to inform him he was preparing a hostile takeover bid for the collapsing Beaumont Holdings, eager to pick over the bones of his brother's failed empire. Caroline's closest friends, the women she lunched and gossiped with, were suddenly unavailable. Their calls went straight to voicemail. The social exclusion was absolute and immediate. As they sat in the back of a black cab, the driver occasionally glancing at them in the rearview mirror with a look of dawning recognition, the silence between them was a chasm. Richard looked at Caroline, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of weary, hollowed-out contempt. "Was it worth it, Caroline?" he asked, his voice flat. "That extra foot of legroom. Was it worth all of this?" Caroline had no answer. She stared out at the grey London streets, her reflection in the window, a ghostly image of the woman she used to be. She had spent her entire life believing that her wealth and her whiteness made her untouchable. She had just learned in the most public and catastrophic way possible that in the modern world, character, or the lack of it, was a debt that always eventually came due. The higher you climbed on a rotten ladder, the further you had to fall. Weeks later, the dust had begun to settle, revealing the stark, altered landscape of the lives involved. For the Beaumonts, the ruin was total. Beaumont Holdings was forced into bankruptcy protection. Richard stripped of his CEO title, and his dignity was left to negotiate the scraps with creditors. Their assets were seized, their homes sold off, their names erased from the glossy pages of society magazines and replaced with headlines about their spectacular fall from grace. They became a cautionary tale, a meme, a symbol of entitled prejudice getting its just desserts in the digital age. Caroline, ostracized and humiliated, retreated from public life entirely. A ghost in the ruins of the life she had torched. For Ascend Air, the incident became a turning point. Under pressure, but also with the guidance of Damien and his team, they launched a company-wide Dignity in the Skies initiative. It involved comprehensive new training protocols for staff on de-escalation and implicit bias. Chloe, the flight attendant, was publicly commended for her grace under pressure and promoted to a training role, becoming the face of the new program. Graham, the purser, was given a Distinguished Service Award. The airline's stock, after a brief dip, rebounded stronger than ever, as they were praised for their decisive handling of the incident and their commitment to new standards. And for Damien Vance, life continued on its upward trajectory. But he, too, was changed by the experience. The Etherian Ascend Air Partnership Project Nightingale was finalized. It was even more ambitious than originally planned, a testament to the new level of trust between the two companies. Etherian's AI would not only streamline Ascend's logistics, but also help identify and flag patterns of passenger misconduct, creating a safer and more respectful environment for both crew and customers. He was in his Gulfstream G700, flying back to New York from a successful launch event in Singapore. Through the large oval window, the earth below was a breathtaking tapestry of swirling white clouds and deep blue ocean. He was reading not Seneca this time, but a collection of poetry by Maya Angelou. The incident on Flight 112 had been a stark reminder of a truth he had known his whole life, that for a black man in his position, the margin for error was zero. He could build a $50 billion company, grace the covers of magazines, and advise world leaders. But in the eyes of some, he would always be reduced to the color of his skin. His presence in a first-class cabin, something to be questioned and challenged. He could have reacted with anger. He could have engaged Caroline Beaumont on her level, creating an even uglier scene. But his greatest power, he knew, was not his wealth or his intellect, but his control. His ability to remain calm, to observe, to allow people's own prejudice to become their undoing. He hadn't destroyed the Beaumonts. He had simply refused to move, and their own toxicity did the rest. It was a victory not of aggression, but of stillness. He thought about the video which he had eventually watched. He saw the fear in Chloe's eyes, the discomfort of the other passengers, the ugly, contorted face of hatred. But he also saw the aftermath, the outpouring of support, the swift corporate justice, the global conversation it had sparked about race and privilege. Perhaps in its own painful way, the incident had served a purpose. It had held up a mirror to a part of society that too often festered in the shadows. His flight attendant, a young man named Ben, approached. "Mr. Vance, can I get you anything?" Damien smiled. "I'm fine, Ben. Thank you. Actually, could you and the flight crew join me when you have a moment? I'd like to thank you personally for a smooth flight." It was a small gesture, but it was everything. He saw people. He valued their work. He understood that respect wasn't something to be demanded from a position of privilege, but something to be earned and given freely regardless of station. As the jet streaked across the sky high above the world and its troubles, Damien Vance felt a sense of profound clarity. He hadn't just won a business deal or triumphed over a bigot. He had affirmed his own philosophy, that true power wasn't about the seat you occupied, but the principles you stood for. And from 35,000 feet, the view of a future built on those principles looked brighter than ever. The story of Damien Vance and Caroline Beaumont isn't just a drama that unfolded in the skies. It's a powerful reflection of our world today. It shows how quickly a life built on arrogance and prejudice can crumble when confronted with quiet strength and undeniable truth. Damien's victory wasn't loud or aggressive. It was the result of patience, intelligence, and a refusal to be defined by someone else's bigotry. The hard karma that hit the Beaumonts serves as a potent reminder that in our hyper-connected world, actions have consequences that travel at the speed of the internet. Their empire wasn't destroyed by Damien, but by the rotten foundations upon which it was built. What do you think? Was the karma they received deserved? Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's entitlement crashed into a wall of reality? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who needs to see it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true-life stories of drama, justice, and karma. Thanks for watching.